Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking what looks like a literal paradigm shift in Australian politics. We're looking at One Nation, a party that, is historically known for some very specific platforms, and how they're rolling out a completely unexpected electoral strategy after a massive historic victory. We're going to map out exactly how this political landscape is shifting beneath our feet. So let's dive right into the mechanics of a party trying to radically expand its power. Just look at the sheer paradox we're dealing with here. On one hand, you've got the established identity of One Nation, basically a party built from the ground up on a historically strict anti-immigration platform. But then you contrast that with their new strategy. They are now actively targeting labor heartlands, specifically zeroing in on areas packed with migrant families in Western Sydney. So you have to ask yourself, how does a party with that history start actively courting migrant demographics? Well, that's exactly the pivot we're going to explore. To make sense of this massive shift, we're going to hit 4 key areas today. First, their unlikely target audience. Second, the historic Farah victory. Third, fueling voter frustration. And finally, their specific demands for supply and confidence. Starting off with part 1, an unlikely target audience, and how they're courting the labor heartland. Listen to this quote directly from the party leader, Pauline Hanson. She's claiming that migrant voters are actually siding with One Nation out of a shared concern for the country's trajectory. Her rationale here? She says these communities are telling her they simply don't want Australia to turn into the very places they just left. It's a fascinating, honestly kind of surprising framing, right? Using the lived experiences of migrants themselves to validate a fiercely nationalist platform. That brings us to part 2, the historic Farah victory, and their big breakthrough in the lower house. That number right there, 1, represents an absolutely massive milestone for the party. It stands for One Nation's very first lower house seat in federal parliament. This breakthrough happened over the weekend in the regional New South Wales seat of Farah, where their candidate David Farley pulled off a historic, total landslide victory. And this single seat? It has totally scrambled the political calculus, leaving opposition MPs openly questioning the whole future of conservative coalitions. This breakdown brilliantly illustrates just how fast the landscape is shifting. One Nation takes the win. The Liberal Party gets absolutely decimated down to 12% in what used to be a stronghold. And the Labour Party, yeah, you're reading that right. They didn't even field a candidate. They literally just didn't show up. As One Nation is quick to point out, Labour's absence and the complete collapse of the Liberals essentially pushed all those frustrated voters straight into their arms. Let's move into part 3. Fueling voter frustration, specifically looking at the economics of energy and climate. To articulate exactly where this voter frustration is coming from, Barnaby Joyce uses a pretty stark geographical comparison. He points over to Singapore, an island with basically no coal, oil, gas, cattle, or uranium, and an economy that's just a fraction the size of ours. Then he looks at Australia, sitting on absolutely abundant resources with the potential to be a global economic superpower. But, Joyce argues, Australia is completely squandering that potential because the major parties are hyper-focused on climate change policies instead of driving economic advancement. Breaking that down a bit more, these are the localized, everyday frustrations they are tapping right into. Joyce argues these are universal issues, whether you're out in regional Australia or, say, running a little coffee shop out in the suburbs. People are furious about overpaying their power bills, which, let's be honest, you've probably felt yourself recently. They're upset about the closing down of coal-fired power stations, safeguard mechanisms targeting fuel refineries, and major party climate targets that are frankly hurting small businesses. People are angry, and they are definitely hungry for change. Which leads us perfectly into part 4, supply, confidence, and demands, or how to hold the balance of power. As One Nation sets its sights on the crossbench, they are making their terms of engagement crystal clear. Barnaby Joyce emphatically rules out any sort of formal coalition with the Liberals and Nationals. He states it plainly right there. We don't want the ministries, we want policy outcomes. The party is flat out rejecting the idea of cabinet solidarity. Why? Because they argue it completely constricts their ability to deliver for the public, forcing them into a status quo that has frankly worked terribly for conservative voters. Basically, they're happy to let the major parties keep the prestigious titles and the big salaries. So instead of a traditional coalition, One Nation is offering something highly transactional: supply and confidence. Just for a quick refresher, supply is simply the ability of a government to pass a budget through Parliament. Without it, you literally can't spend money. Confidence is the ability to survive a vote of no confidence and actually stay in power. One Nation is offering to provide these 2 massive lifelines to keep a government functioning, but only for a very, very strict price. And here is exactly what that price looks like. Any major party wanting their votes to govern must commit to this concrete program. First, rid Australia of intermittent power dependency. Second, adjust immigration levels specifically so everyday Australians can actually afford to buy houses. Third, focus government resources strictly on regional areas and the western suburbs. And finally, completely abandon the chase for those inner-city progressive teal seats. They want these outcomes, guaranteed. In pursuing this totally hardline strategy, the party is also actively attempting to rebrand its public image. Addressing historic criticisms of the party's rhetoric, Barnaby Joyce points out anecdotally that even Aboriginal people stop him on the street to ask for selfies. He argues that the public doesn't view One Nation as racist. Instead, they respect them for being tough. It's a very calculated framing, aiming to position their uncompromising, rigid demands as a political strength rather than a liability. Which brings us to the ultimate question. As One Nation demands these uncompromising policy outcomes in exchange for government survival, what is the actual fallout going to be? Will this bold, hardline strategy successfully reshape Australia's balance of power and upend the political establishment? Or will it just fracture the Conservative vote and keep their opponents in power? It is a huge, high-stakes gamble that won't just define the next chapter of politics, it could completely reshape the policies impacting your own community. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer. We'll see you next time.